Look closely at the metal gears of a modern factory, the global shipping routes, and the mass production systems of the modern world. All of these immense structures trace their lineage back to a single paper-thin piece of cloth. Before the 18th century, the baseline for European fashion was miserable. If you lived in London or Paris, you wore heavy, itchy, stiff wool or coarse linen. These materials were incredibly difficult to wash, took days to dry, and consequently, they constantly smelled. Then the East India Company stumbled into a textile gold mine. While trying to buy spices in Southeast Asia, they realized local merchants didn't want European wool. They wanted Indian cotton. So the company started trading for calico, a lightweight printed cotton from India, to use as barter. But when ships brought leftover calico back to Europe, it sparked an obsession. To a European in the 1600s, Indian cotton felt like a different technology. It was breathable and incredibly light against the skin, while its floral patterns remained vivid even after repeated washing, a level of detail and color durability that no European wool could achieve. Rich nobles and ordinary citizens alike bought every yard they could find. This imported cotton immediately threatened the centuries-old dominance of the domestic wool and silk gilts. Europe had encountered its first wave of fast fashion. The scale of the demand was staggering. By 1680, England alone imported over 1 million pieces of calico in a single year. It entirely took over wardrobes, and wealthy families even used the brightly colored fabric as wallpaper to decorate their elaborate dollhouses. This consumer frenzy devastated the local economy. Traditional European weavers, unable to compete with the cheap, beautiful imports, watched their markets evaporate. Thousands of silk and wool workers went bankrupt, plunging entire communities into mass unemployment and starvation. Daniel Defoe, the highly influential author of Robinson Crusoe, stepped into this chaos. He began writing aggressive pamphlets, branding the Indian fabric as a creeping plague infiltrating the English bedroom. He explicitly blamed the vanity and desires of female consumers for destroying the nation from within. Defoe successfully mutated a simple trade deficit into a profound moral panic. By framing the purchase of a dress as a direct threat to national security, he handed the government the public outrage it needed to intervene. The economic anxiety on the streets of London finally boiled over into physical violence. Mobs of starving, unemployed weavers began staging massive riots, explicitly targeting women who dared to walk outside wearing imported calico. The attacks were brutally calculated. The rioters armed themselves with aqua fortis, the highly corrosive nitric acid used by metal workers. They surrounded women in broad daylight, ripping their dresses and throwing the acid directly onto the fabric to burn holes through the floral prints. European governments responded by criminalizing consumer taste. The Edict of 1686 in France and the Calico Act of 1721 in England moved beyond taxation, making the import, sale, and even the personal wearing of printed cotton a punishable offense. Lawmakers believed that by banning modern, comfortable fabrics, they could force their citizens to retreat to the heavy woolen garments of the past. Making calico illegal failed to kill the demand for it. Instead, the ban wiped out the foreign competition, leaving a massive, highly lucrative vacuum in the market for any European manufacturer who could figure out how to produce it locally. But the European manufacturers immediately hit a wall. When they tried to print patterns onto cotton, the colors washed out and faded almost instantly. They completely lacked the complex scientific knowledge required to make dyes stick to plant-based fibers. Look at the Indian dyeing process. Artisans utilized mordants, chemical binding agents, drawing floral outlines with a clear liquid. When submerged in dye, the color strictly adheres only to the treated areas, while untreated fabric washes clean, leaving a permanent pattern. Replicating this chemical process became the most lucrative technical challenge in European history. Solving the puzzle of permanent dyes meant capturing an entire black market of consumers who refused to return to wool. The French government initiated one of the earliest operations of state-sponsored corporate espionage. They dispatched spies and Jesuit priests deep into India to secretly document the artisan processes and smuggle the chemical dye formulas back to Europe. Even after stealing the chemistry, England faced a unique barrier. English human labor was far too expensive to compete with Indian prices, and the laws strictly banning the weaving of pure cotton were still active. Inventors found a legal loophole. The ban did not apply to fustian, a mixed fabric woven with a linen warp and a cotton weft. This loophole created a highly protected domestic incubator where British manufacturers could experiment without fearing cheap Indian imports. To bypass the high cost of human hands, inventors designed radical new machinery. Devices like the water-powered spinning frame could spin multiple threads simultaneously, driven entirely by the mechanical force of a river rather than human muscle. The laws designed to protect the medieval wool industry inadvertently prioritized mechanical innovation. By forcing manufacturers to automate spinning to compete with Indian quality, these protectionist acts helped build the technical foundation for the factory system that would soon redefine global production. The newly mechanized power of Europe immediately generated a dark consequence. Factories began mass-producing a cheap imitation of Indian calico, which became widely known as guinea cloth. As this map of the triangular trade illustrates, guinea cloth became a literal currency. European merchants shipped massive volumes of this machine-made fabric to the West African coast, where it accounted for up to 50% of the goods traded to purchase enslaved people. This formed a grim, cyclical trap. Enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas, where they were forced to harvest the raw cotton that fed the very European machines driving the trade. Empowered by their new machines, Britain eventually repealed the Calico Acts. They flooded global markets, including the markets of India, with highly subsidized, cheap machine-made cotton, entirely destroying the ancient artisan economy that had originally inspired them. Attempting to block consumer desire through legislation almost always fails. The demand for lightweight, beautiful clothing proved stronger than the laws of massive empires. Every time we purchase a cheap piece of fast fashion today, we are casting a vote in a global economic war, exactly as consumers did 300 years ago when they unknowingly forced the creation of the modern world.